10,000 trees, falling in a single day, one logging camp operating from dawn until darkness, 200 men with axes and crosscut saws working through a forest like locusts through a wheat field. Every minute, another tree would crash to the ground. Every hour, 60 trees reduced to logs. Every day, 10,000 trees that had been growing for decades or centuries cut down, de-limbed, bucked to length, and hauled to the nearest railroad. This wasn't preservation. This wasn't sustainability. This was industrial-scale resource extraction powered entirely by human muscle and hand tools. And it happened every day, at dozens of camps across America, because the railroads needed wood. Millions of railroad ties, thousands of trestles and bridges, endless construction lumber. The appetite was insatiable. Sure, and the logging camps existed to feed it. This was America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the railroad system was consuming wood at a rate that's difficult to comprehend. A railroad needed 14,000 ties per mile of track. Those ties rotted and had to be replaced every 5 to 10 years. A transcontinental railroad might operate 5,000 miles of track, which meant 70 million ties in the ground at any time, and 7 to 14 million new ties needed annually just for replacement. And that's just one railroad. There were dozens of railroads. Then add the construction lumber for bridges, trestles, stations, warehouses, and all the other wooden infrastructure railroads required. The demand for lumber was measured in billions of board feet per year. The solution was the large-scale logging camp. These weren't small operations. A major logging camp in the Pacific Northwest or the Upper Midwest might employ 200 to 500 workers. The camp would be located in virgin timber, forest that had never been logged, with trees 200, 300, 400 years old, standing 100 feet tall or more. The loggers would systematically cut through this forest, taking every tree large enough to be commercially valuable. They'd work at a pace that left no time for careful selection or preservation. The goal was volume. Cut as many trees as possible, as fast as possible, convert them to lumber or ties, ship them to the railroad, and move on to the next section of forest. Could 200 men really cut 10,000 trees in a day using only hand tools? Could they maintain that pace day after day, month after month? And could they do it safely, or were the injuries and deaths simply accepted as the cost of production? The answer to the first two questions is yes. The answer to the third is that safety was never a priority. Men died regularly in logging camps. The operations continued without pause. Before we get to the daily operations, you need to understand the scale of demand that drove this level of production. Because 10,000 trees per day sounds excessive until you calculate how much wood the railroads actually needed. A single railroad tie requires cutting one tree. The tree needs to be 10 to 12 inches in diameter and tall enough to yield an 8-foot tie after squaring. That's a tree that's probably 40 to 60 years old in a managed forest, maybe 80 to 100 years old in natural forest. For 14,000 ties per mile of track, you need 14,000 trees. For 5,000 miles of track, that's 70 million trees in the ground at any time. With a replacement cycle of 7 years on average, you need 10 million new ties per year for one railroad. At 10,000 trees per day, one logging camp can produce about 3 million trees per year, working 300 days. You'd need 3 or 4 camps just to supply the tie demand for a single major railroad. But ties weren't the only demand. Railroad bridge and trestle construction was consuming timber at staggering rates. A large timber trestle might use 2 to 4 million board feet of lumber. That's roughly 400 to 800 large trees. Railroads were building hundreds of bridges and trestles. A major railroad construction project might build 50 to 100 bridges in a single year. That's 20 to 80,000 trees just for bridges, in addition to the tie demand. Then there was construction lumber for all the other infrastructure: stations, warehouses, water towers, coal bunkers, maintenance buildings, bunkhouses for workers. All of it built from wood. A medium-sized railroad yard might require 500,000 board feet of lumber for buildings and structures. Multiply that across hundreds of yards and thousands of miles of railroad, and the demand becomes astronomical. The logging camps that supplied this demand were industrial operations. A large camp might cover several acres. with bunkhouses for workers, a cookhouse that could feed 500 men, stables for horses and oxen, a blacksmith shop for tool repair, a filing shed where saws were sharpened, and storage areas for equipment and supplies. The camp would be connected to the railroad by a logging railroad, narrow-gauge track specifically built to haul logs out of the forest. The workforce was organized into specialized crews: fallers, the men who actually cut down the trees; buckers, who cut the felled trees into logs of specified lengths; swampers, who cleared brush and prepared skid roads for hauling logs; teamsters, who managed the horses or oxen that pulled logs; landing men, who loaded logs onto rail cars; and the support staff: cooks, blacksmiths, saw filers, camp supervisors. The daily routine in a logging camp was rigid and brutal. Workers would wake at 4:30 or 5 in the morning. They'd dress, wash quickly in cold water, and head to the cookhouse. Breakfast was at 5:15, massive quantities of food designed to fuel hard physical labor. Flapjacks, bacon, beans, bread, coffee. Men would eat quickly and in silence. At 6, they'd head to their work areas. The fallers would carry their saws and axes into the section of forest designated for that day's cutting. The other crews would follow. The felling process was standardized for efficiency. A team of 2 fallers, called a falling crew, would select a tree. They'd examine it to determine the best direction for it to fall, considering the terrain, nearby trees, and where they wanted the log to end up. Then they'd start cutting. The selection of which tree to cut next was itself a skill. An experienced faller could look at a group of trees and identify the one that would fall cleanly without hanging up in adjacent trees. They'd consider the lean, the natural direction the tree was already leaning due to wind or uneven growth. They'd look at the crown, the weight distribution of the branches at the top. A tree with a heavy lean to one side would naturally want to fall that way. Fighting against a strong lean was dangerous and difficult. The tool was a cross-cut saw. A saw with teeth on both sides and handles on both ends, designed to be operated by 2 men working in tandem. One man would pull, while the other allowed the saw to move, then reverse. The rhythm was constant: pull, release, pull, release. The saw would bite into the wood with each stroke, removing a thin line of sawdust. On a large tree, 3 or 4 feet in diameter, the cut might take 30 to 45 minutes. On smaller trees, 12 to 18 inches, 10 to 15 minutes. The crosscut saw itself was a precision instrument despite appearing simple. The teeth were filed to specific patterns depending on the wood being cut. Raker teeth cleaned sawdust out of the cut. Cutter teeth did the actual cutting. The spacing and angle of the teeth determined how aggressive the saw cut and how quickly it would dull. A well-maintained saw, properly sharpened, would cut through wood smoothly with minimal effort from the workers. A dull or improperly filed saw would bind in the cut, requiring the workers to force it, wasting energy and slowing production. The filing of saws was skilled work done by specialists. Each logging camp had a filing shed where saws were sharpened at the end of each day. The filer would examine each saw, checking for damaged or broken teeth. They'd file each tooth individually, maintaining the correct angle and depth. A good filer could restore a dull saw to perfect cutting condition in about an hour. Poor filing could ruin a saw, making it useless until properly refiled. The cutting technique required skill. The fallers would first cut an undercut, a notch on the side where they wanted the tree to fall. The undercut was typically cut about 1/3 of the way through the tree's diameter. Then they'd make the back cut from the opposite side, cutting toward the undercut but stopping before meeting it, leaving a hinge of wood. The hinge would control the fall, keeping the tree falling in the intended direction. When the back cut was deep enough, the tree's weight would overcome the hinge and the tree would fall. The undercut was crucial to controlling the fall direction. The standard undercut consisted of 2 cuts meeting at an angle. The first cut, called the face cut, was a horizontal cut into the tree. The second cut, the angled cut, met the face cut at about a 45-degree angle, creating a wedge-shaped notch. The size and position of this notch determined where the tree would fall. A properly cut undercut would allow the tree to fall precisely in the intended direction. The back cut technique required careful judgment. The fallers would start the cut about 2 inches above the horizontal line of the undercut. They'd saw straight through toward the undercut, maintaining a level cut. As the saw got deeper, they'd start to feel the tree's weight compressing the wood. At this point, they might drive wedges into the back cut to prevent the saw from binding. Thus, the wedges also help control the fall. Driving wedges deeper would apply pressure, encouraging the tree to start falling. The critical moment came when the back cut was deep enough that only a few inches of hinge wood remained. The tree's enormous weight would be balanced on this narrow hinge. The slightest wind or shift in weight distribution could start the fall. Experienced fallers could sense this moment. They'd stop sawing, remove the saw, and watch the tree carefully. They'd listen for the cracking sound that indicated the hinge starting to fail. When they heard it, they'd yell, "Timber!" and run to a predetermined safe position. The moment when a tree started to fall was dangerous. When the base of the tree could kick back, called barber chairing, where the tree would split vertically and the base would shoot backward with tremendous force. A man standing in the wrong position could be crushed or impaled by the kicking base. The falling tree itself was a hazard. If it hung up in another tree, called a widowmaker, it created a situation where a huge tree was suspended overhead, ready to fall at any moment. And when the tree hit the ground, branches could break and fly in unpredictable directions. The escape route was planned before the first cut was made. Each faller would identify a path to move quickly away from the falling tree, typically at a 45-degree angle from the direction of fall. The ground had to be clear of obstacles that could trip them. When the tree started to fall, both men would move to their escape route simultaneously, watching the tree as they moved. They'd keep moving until the tree hit the ground, and they were certain no secondary hazards, falling branches or other trees knocked over, were going to strike them. The danger of falling trees was constant and real. Trees didn't always fall as planned. A slight miscalculation in the undercut angle could send a tree falling 10 or 20 degrees off the intended direction. A sudden wind gust could push a falling tree off course. An unseen defect in the wood, rot, or a hollow center could cause the tree to break unpredictably during the fall. And even a perfectly executed fall could create hazards when the tree hit the ground and branches broke loose. A good falling crew, working steadily, could fell 20 to 30 trees in a 10-hour day. With 100 falling crews in a large camp, that's 2,000 to 3,000 trees felled per day. But felling was only the first step. The trees had to be processed. The bucking crews would follow the fallers. Their job was to cut the felled trees into logs of specified lengths. For ties, that meant 8-foot sections. For saw logs, logs that would go to sawmills, the length might be 16, 20, or 24 feet, depending on specifications. The buckers used cross-cut saws, working with the same 2-man rhythm as the fallers. A bucker crew could process perhaps 40 to 50 trees per day, cutting each tree into multiple logs. But cutting the trees and bucking them into logs was still only part of the operation. Those logs, tens of thousands of them, had to be moved from the cutting area to the landing where the logging railroad could pick them up. This hauling operation was itself a massive undertaking that employed perhaps a third of the camp's workforce. The hauling method depended on terrain and season. In flat or gently rolling terrain, logs would be pulled on wheeled carts or wagons. In steep terrain, they'd be dragged directly on the ground. In winter, in the northern camps, logs would be loaded onto sleds that could slide over snow and ice. The power came from horses or oxen, typically teams of 2 to 8 animals depending on the size and weight of the load. The preparation of skid roads was critical to efficient hauling. In swampers, workers assigned to trail preparation would clear paths through the forest from the cutting areas to the landing. They'd remove stumps and large rocks, fill in depressions, and create routes that teams could navigate. In winter camps, the skid roads would be iced. Workers would spread water on the snow surface at night, letting it freeze into a smooth, slippery surface that reduced friction and allowed teams to pull heavier loads. A typical team pulling 8-foot tie logs might haul 50 to 100 logs per trip, depending on the distance and terrain. If the landing was a mile from the cutting area, a team might make 4 or 5 round trips per day. With 50 teams operating simultaneously, that's 10 to 20,000 logs moved to the landing per day. This scale of operation required careful coordination. The Teamsters had to space their trips so they weren't all trying to load or unload at the same time. The roads had to be maintained constantly. A rut or washed-out section could bring operations to a halt. The Teamsters themselves were skilled workers who commanded wages comparable to the fallers. A good Teamster knew how to handle a team of horses or oxen, how to load a sleigh or wagon for balance, how to navigate difficult terrain, and how to judge when their team was being pushed too hard. They developed relationships with their animals, learning each horse or ox's temperament and capabilities. A Teamster might work with the same team for an entire season, and some would become protective of their animals, refusing to overload or push them beyond reasonable limits. So this sometimes created conflict with the camp supervisors who wanted maximum production. A supervisor might order a Teamster to take a larger load or make one more trip before dark. If the Teamster judged that this would harm or exhaust the animals, they might refuse. This could result in the Teamster being fired, but most supervisors recognized that a skilled Teamster who kept their team healthy was more valuable than a compliant one who broke down their animals through overwork. The loading at the landing was another operation requiring coordination and hard labor. In the simplest operations, logs would be rolled onto rail cars by hand, using peavies and cant hooks. Teams of workers would position a log, then roll it up ramps onto the car, pack it against previous logs, and secure it with chains. This was back-breaking work and relatively slow, perhaps 50 to 100 logs per hour for a skilled crew. Larger camps used mechanical loaders, typically steam-powered cranes that could lift logs and place them on cars. These greatly increased loading speed, but they required trained operators and maintenance. A steam loader might load 200 to 300 logs per hour, allowing a landing crew to keep up with the hauling teams, bringing logs from the cutting areas. The scale of work required coordination. The camp superintendent would plan each day's operations, assigning crews to specific areas, ensuring the right number of fallers, buckers, swampers, and teamsters were in the right places. The goal was continuous flow, trees being felled at a rate that kept the buckers busy, and logs being bucked fast enough to keep the teamsters hauling constantly, and logs arriving at the landing at a rate that kept the loading crews working. The physical demands on the workers were extreme. Sawing through 3-foot diameter trees with a crosscut saw for 10 hours requires sustained strength and endurance. Your arms, shoulders, and back are working constantly. Your hands develop calluses from gripping the saw handles. The work is repetitive, the same motion thousands of times per day. The pace is relentless. There's no time to rest between trees. As soon as one tree is cut, you move to the next. Among the loggers was a man named Anders Nilsson, a Swedish immigrant who worked in logging camps in Minnesota and Wisconsin from 1885 to 1903. Nilsson kept a diary, portions of which have been preserved by his descendants. His entries describe the daily routine and the physical toll. From March 1887, woke before dawn, breakfast in darkness, to the woods by first light. My partner Johan and I felled 26 trees today. My arms ache. My hands are raw despite gloves. My back is in constant pain. We work without stopping from dawn until we can no longer see to cut safely. Then back to camp. Supper. Immediately to bed. Too tired even to write more than this. Nilsson's diary also records the injuries common in logging work. From June 1889. A tree kicked back on Eric Larson today. The base split and shot backward as the tree fell. Eric was struck in the chest and crushed against another tree. He died within minutes. We carried his body back to camp. The superintendent noted his name in the death ledger. Eric had no family that we know of. He will be buried at the edge of the camp. Work continues tomorrow. Another entry from August 1891. Peter Johansson was struck by a falling branch today. A widowmaker came down without warning and hit him on the head. His skull was crushed. He died before we could get him to camp. Peter was 23 years old. He had been working in the camp for 2 months. The superintendent will write to his family in Sweden to inform them. Nilsson's entries also describe the monotony and exhaustion of the work. From November 1893, every day is the same. Wake, eat, cut trees, eat, cut more trees, sleep. My hands are permanently calloused. My back has not stopped aching in months. I no longer remember what it feels like to be rested. Johan talks of returning to Sweden, but neither of us has saved enough money. We will work another season, and probably another after that. Nilsson himself was injured seriously in 1899 when a hung tree, a tree caught in the branches of another tree, fell unexpectedly while he was working nearby. The falling tree struck him, breaking his leg and several ribs. He was unable to work for 3 months and received no pay during his recovery. When he returned to work, he found his job had been taken by another man. He eventually found work at a different camp, but never regained his previous strength. He left logging in 1903 and worked as a janitor in Duluth until his death in 1924. Another documented logger was Michael O'Connor, an Irish immigrant who worked in logging camps in Maine from 1882 to 1908. O'Connor's letters to his brother in Ireland provide insight into the financial realities of logging work and the hardships of camp life. From a letter dated February 1884. I am working in a logging camp in the North Woods. The work is harder than anything I've ever done. We cut trees from dawn until dark, 6 days a week. The camp is primitive, a bunkhouse with 60 men sleeping in crude beds, inadequate heat, no comfort. The food is poor, beans and salt pork every day. I am cold constantly, but the pay is $2 per day, which is better than I could earn elsewhere. I am saving money to bring Mary and the children from Ireland. From a letter in July 1886, the winter season has ended. I worked 5 months in the camp and earned approximately $250. From this, I paid $60 for supplies and equipment, boots, gloves, clothing that wore out from the work. I spent another $40 on various necessities during the season, when I am left with $150, which I am sending to Mary. It is not enough to bring the family over, but perhaps next year. O'Connor's letters also describe the dangers. From January 1890, we have lost another man. Patrick Murphy was buried under a log pile that shifted. The logs rolled over him. He was killed instantly. Patrick had worked with me for 3 years. He had a wife and 4 children in Boston. The company will pay his wife $20. She and her children will be left destitute. This is the 4th man to die in this camp in the 2 months I have been here this season. O'Connor survived his logging career, but was left with permanent injuries. His final letter from 1908 describes the toll. I am finished with logging. My back is ruined from years of sawing. My hands are crippled with arthritis. I can barely hold tools. I am 48 years old and feel like an ancient man. I will try to find easier work, though I do not know what a crippled Irishman can do in America. At least I was able to bring Mary and the children over. They are here, and that is something. A third documented worker was Józef Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who worked in logging camps in the upper Midwest from 1895 to 1912. Kowalski worked primarily as a bucker, cutting felled trees into logs. His nephew, who interviewed him in the 1930s and recorded his stories, preserved his account. According to Kowalski, the bucking work was as demanding as falling, but paid less. The fallers made $2.50 or $3 per day. We buckers made $2, sometimes $1.75. But our work was just as hard. We used the same crosscut saws, cutting through the same hard wood. But we worked lower to the ground, often bent over, cutting trees that were already down. My back was destroyed by years of bending to make cuts. Kowalski described the production pressure. The camp boss would walk through the cutting areas every day, counting how many trees each crew had processed. If you were behind, he would tell you to work faster or you would be fired. There was always someone willing to take your place. Men arrived at the camp every week looking for work. If you couldn't maintain the pace, you were replaced immediately. He also described a serious accident in 1907. I was cutting through a large oak tree that had been felled the previous day. The tree was under tension. The weight was resting on the branches, creating stress in the wood. When my partner and I cut through, after the tension released suddenly, the tree split and the end whipped around. I was struck in the chest and thrown backward. My ribs were broken. I was unconscious for 2 days. When I woke, I was in a hospital in Duluth. The camp had paid to have me transported there and paid for 1 week of hospital care. After that, I was on my own. I had no money and could not work. I nearly died from complications. When I recovered enough to work, I had been gone for 2 months. I returned to the camp and was given my old job back, but at reduced pay because I had not built up seniority again. Kowalski worked in logging until 1912, when he was 42 years old. His nephew's notes record, Uncle Joseph finally left the camps when his health was too poor to continue. He had chronic respiratory problems from breathing sawdust and working in cold conditions. His joints were arthritic. He could barely stand straight after years of bent-over bucking work. He found work as a watchman at a warehouse in Milwaukee, earning $1 per day, half what he had made in the camps, but the work was easier, and he could rest. The mortality rate in large logging camps was significant. Based on available records, approximately 5 to 10% of workers in a logging camp would be killed or seriously injured in a given year. For a camp with 200 workers, that meant 10 to 20 deaths or major injuries annually. The deaths were accepted as inevitable. The operations continued without interruption. The pace of work was driven by economics. The logging companies were contracted to supply specific volumes of lumber or ties to the railroads. The contracts specified delivery schedules and penalties for failure to meet them. The camp superintendents were under constant pressure to maintain production. That pressure filtered down to the workers. Crews that didn't meet their quotas were assigned worse jobs or fired. Workers who couldn't maintain the pace were replaced. The pay was relatively good by the standards of the era, $2 to $3 per day for experienced fallers, $1.50 to $2 for buckers and other labor. That's about $60 to $90 modern equivalent per day. But the work was seasonal. Logging camps in the north operated primarily in winter when the ground was frozen and logs could be hauled on snow. A logger might work 5 or 6 months per year in the camps, earning enough to survive the rest of the year. Some would work in sawmills during the off-season. Others would drift to other seasonal work, farming, construction, whatever was available. The working conditions in the camps themselves were crude. The bunkhouses were rough wooden buildings with rows of bunks, typically double or triple high. The buildings were heated with wood stoves, which created extreme temperature variations, too hot near the stove, cold at the edges of the room. Ventilation was poor. The smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and wood smoke was pervasive. The bunks were uncomfortable, straw mattresses on wooden frames, thin blankets, no privacy. The food was substantial but monotonous. Breakfast was flapjacks, bacon, beans. Lunch, eaten in the woods, was bread, salt pork, perhaps some cheese. Dinner was beans, potatoes, more salt pork or beef, bread, and pie for dessert. The calories were adequate for hard labor, but the variety was minimal. Scurvy was common in camps that operated for months without fresh vegetables. Dysentery was endemic due to poor sanitation. The camps were all-male environments, isolated from towns and families. The nearest settlement might be 10 or 20 miles away, accessible only by the logging railroad or rough roads. Workers would sometimes go months without leaving the camp. The isolation and living conditions led to friction. Fights were common. Some camps had significant problems with alcohol. Workers would smuggle whiskey into camp and drink on their limited time off, leading to drunken brawls. The environmental impact of these large-scale logging operations was devastating in localized areas. A camp cutting 10,000 trees per day would completely clear perhaps 50 to 100 acres of forest per day, depending on tree density. In a year of operation, that's 15 to 30,000 acres, roughly 25 to 50 square miles of forest stripped to bare ground. The logged areas would be left with stumps, branches, and debris. Soil erosion would begin immediately. Streams would silt up. Wildlife habitat would be destroyed. In some areas, the logging companies would move through a region systematically, logging out entire forests over the course of a decade or two. The cutover lands, the areas that had been logged, would be left as wastelands. Some would eventually regenerate to forest. Watch, but the new growth was different from the original. The large, old trees were gone. The forest that regrew was younger, denser, with different species composition. The specific operations of a large logging camp followed a pattern that was refined over decades. A typical day in a camp cutting for railroad ties would look like this. 5 a.m. Wake-up bell. Workers rise, dress, head to the wash house. 5:15 a.m. Breakfast. 500 men eating in shifts, quickly and silently. The cookhouse crew has been working since 4 a.m. to prepare the meal. 6 a.m. Work begins. The fallers head into the forest to the area marked for today's cutting. They carry their saws, axes, and files for sharpening. The buckers follow, moving to areas where trees were felled yesterday. The swampers are clearing brush and maintaining skid roads. The teamsters are preparing the horses and oxen. 6:30 a.m. The sound of saws begins. A large camp with 100 falling crews might have 200 cross-cut saws working simultaneously. The rhythm is constant, the back and forth motion of the saws, the periodic crash of falling trees. 7 a.m. The first trees are down. The buckers begin cutting them into 8-foot tie logs. The teamsters begin hauling the first loads of logs from yesterday's cutting to the landing where the logging railroad is located. By 9 a.m., the camp is operating at full capacity. Trees are falling continuously. The buckers can't keep up with the fallers. They'll be processing today's trees tomorrow. The teamsters are hauling constantly, a steady stream of log-laden sleds or wagons moving from the cutting area to the landing. At the landing, like the loading crews are using steam-powered loaders or manual methods to get logs onto rail cars. Noon, lunch break. The workers eat lunch in the woods, cold food brought from camp. The break is 30 minutes. Some men use the time to sharpen their saws or rest. Most just eat and prepare to resume work. 12:30 p.m., work resumes. The afternoon proceeds like the morning. The rhythm continues. Trees fall, logs are cut, loads are hauled. 4 p.m., the light is beginning to fade. The pace doesn't slow. The fallers are trying to fell as many trees as possible before darkness makes the work too dangerous. 5:30 p.m. Work stops. It's too dark to continue safely. The crews head back to camp. Tools are stored. The workers head to the wash house to clean up, washing faces and hands in cold water. I'm trying to remove the worst of the day's grime. 6 p.m. Dinner. Another massive meal. The workers are exhausted and eat without much conversation. 7 p.m. Free time. Some men play cards, some write letters, some just lie in their bunks. The conversation is minimal. Everyone is too tired. The blacksmith and saw filers are working, repairing equipment and sharpening saws for tomorrow. 8:30 p.m. Most workers are asleep. The camp is quiet except for the snoring in the bunkhouses and the sounds of the blacksmith shop where night shift workers are still preparing for tomorrow. This schedule repeated 6 days a week. Sunday was nominally a day off, but equipment maintenance continued, and workers often used the day to repair their clothing, write letters, or simply recover from the week's exhaustion. The production numbers from large logging camps are documented in company records. The L.A. Weyerhaeuser Company operated a camp near Cloquet, Minnesota in the 1890s that employed about 300 workers. Company records show that in the winter logging season of 1895 to 1896, the camp produced approximately 2.5 million railroad ties, about 8,000 ties per day during the operating season. That's 8,000 trees cut, delimbed, bucked, and hauled in a single day, day after day, for 5 months. Another documented operation was the Northwest Lumber Company's Camp No. 7 near Spokane, Washington. In the 1902 season, with a workforce of about 400 workers, the camp produced approximately 30 million board feet of saw logs, equivalent to about 6,000 large trees cut and processed. The camp operated for 6 months that year, which works out to about 1,000 trees per day. These numbers represent the achievable output using only hand tools and animal power. The workers were cutting trees with axes and crosscut saws, hauling logs with horses and oxen, loading rail cars by hand or with simple steam-powered devices. The level of production was achieved through organization, specialization, and relentless pace, rather than through technology. The economics of these operations were driven by the railroad contracts. A railroad might contract for delivery of 1 million ties at 15 cents per tie, a contract worth $150,000, equivalent to about $4.5 million today. The logging company would estimate that they could produce those ties for 10 cents each, 7 cents for labor, 2 cents for equipment and overhead, 1 cent for transportation. That left a 5-cent profit per tie, or $50,000 on the contract, but only if they met the delivery schedule. Failure to deliver on time could result in penalties that wiped out the profit entirely. This economic pressure meant that camp superintendents pushed workers to the absolute limit of what was physically possible. There was no concern for sustainability or worker welfare. The goal was to extract maximum timber in minimum time. The workers who couldn't maintain the pace were fired and replaced. The forests were cut without regard to future regeneration. The system worked, from the company's perspective, because there was always more forest to log and more workers desperate enough to take the jobs. The decline of hand logging came gradually with the introduction of mechanization. The steam donkey, a steam-powered winch that could haul logs, appeared in the late 1800s and gradually replaced animal power. The chainsaw was developed in the 1920s and 1930s, and by the 1950s had largely replaced the crosscut saw. These technologies allowed smaller crews to achieve the same production levels that had required hundreds of hand loggers. But during the hand logging era, roughly from the 1870s through the 1920s, the large-scale camps operating with pure muscle power were the backbone of railroad timber supply. Tens of thousands of workers labored in these camps. They cut billions of board feet of timber. They transformed millions of acres of virgin forest into cut-over wasteland, and most of them are completely forgotten. The workers like Anders Nielsen, sawing through trees in Minnesota winters. The men like Eric Larson and Peter Johansson, killed by the inherent dangers of the work. The thousands of unnamed loggers who spent seasons or years in camps, working from dawn to darkness, living in rough bunkhouses, eating monotonous food, saving money to send home to families or to support themselves through the off-season. These men powered the wood supply that made railroad expansion possible. They did it with axes and saws. They did it at a pace that would be considered impossible if we didn't have the production records proving it happened. When you think about the railroads crossing America, you might think about the steel rails, the locomotives, the engineering achievements, but underneath all of that is wood. Millions of ties, thousands of bridges and trestles, countless buildings and structures. All of that wood came from somewhere. It came from forests, cut by men working in camps, operating at industrial scale with hand tools. 10,000 trees per day, 200 men working from dawn to dusk, every single day for months at a time, year after year. The forests are gone now, mostly. The camps are gone, the logging railroads have been pulled up, the bunkhouses and cookhouses have rotted away or been torn down. What remains are the records, the production logs, the death ledgers, the occasional diary or letter that survived, and the landscape itself, the vast stretches of cut-over land that have regenerated to second-growth forest, noticeably different from what was there before. That's the legacy of the industrial-scale hand-logging era. The scale of production that seems impossible, but was achieved through organization, specialization, and relentless human effort. 10,000 trees per day, cut by 200 men with axes and crosscut saws, building the wood supply that built the railroads that connected America.